Lady Death, as known as the legend of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the rifle scope trembled slightly as Lyudmila steadied her breathing. Through the crosshairs, she could see him, the Nazi officer who'd been terrorizing her unit for 3 days. Her finger rested gently on the trigger. 1 heartbeat. 2, 3, the shot rang out across the frozen Ukrainian steppe, and another enemy soldier fell. It was June 1942, and this young woman from Kiev had just claimed her 187th confirmed kill. But the world didn't know her name yet. They didn't know that before this war ended, she would become the deadliest female sniper in history, with 309 confirmed kills. They didn't know she'd survive wounds that would kill most men, face enemies who put a bounty on her head, and ultimately meet presidents and royalty. This is her story, the true story of how a factory worker became Lady Death, the woman the Germans feared more than entire battalions. The girl who loved shooting, Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko, was born on July 12, 1916, in the small Ukrainian town of Biela Tserkva, about 50 miles south of Kiev. Her birth came during one of the most turbulent periods in Russian history. World War I raged across Europe, and revolutionary fervor was building throughout the Russian Empire. Within a year of her birth, the Bolshevik Revolution would transform her world forever. Her father, Mikhail, worked as a laborer, moving from job to support his family. Her mother worked in a factory. They were simple people, working-class Russians trying to survive in extraordinarily difficult times. When Lyudmila was young, the family moved to Kiev, the ancient capital of Ukraine, seeking better opportunities in the larger city. Kiev in the 1920s was a city rebuilding itself. The civil war that followed the revolution had devastated much of the country, but there was hope in the air, hope that the new Soviet system would bring prosperity and equality to all. Young Lyudmila grew up surrounded by this revolutionary optimism, attending school and dreaming of her future. She was not a typical girl for her time. While other girls played with dolls and practiced domestic skills, Lyudmila was drawn to more unconventional pursuits. She was athletic, competitive, and fearless. Her teachers noted her sharp mind and her determination to excel at whatever she attempted. But nothing would shape her destiny more than a conversation she overheard when she was 14 years old. The birth of a marksman. In 1930, a boy in her neighborhood was bragging about joining a shooting club. Lyudmila overheard him boasting about his skills with a rifle, claiming that shooting was too difficult for girls. Something in his dismissive tone ignited a fire in the young teenager. She marched straight to the shooting club and demanded to join. The instructors were skeptical. A 14-year-old girl wanting to learn to shoot? It was unusual, to say the least. But there was something in Lyudmila's eyes, a determination and intensity that made them reconsider. They agreed to let her try. From her very first session, it was clear that Lyudmila had a natural gift. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp, and most importantly, she had the temperament of a true marksman. Shooting requires more than just good aim. It requires patience, discipline, and the ability to control your breathing and heartbeat. Lyudmila possessed all these qualities instinctively. She practiced relentlessly. While other teenagers were at dances or social gatherings, Lyudmila was at the shooting range, perfecting her craft. She studied the physics of ballistics, learned to account for wind and distance, and developed the mental focus required for precision shooting. Within a year, she had surpassed many of the boys who had been shooting for years. Her prowess with a rifle earned her respect in the shooting club, but it also gave her something more valuable: confidence. In a society that often limited women's opportunities, Lyudmila had found something she could excel at on her own merits. The rifle was an equalizer. It didn't care about gender, only about skill and determination. Building a life. As Lyudmila entered her late teens, she balanced multiple pursuits. She continued her education, showing particular aptitude in history. She also began working in a factory, like her mother before her, to help support her family. The work was hard, long hours and difficult conditions, but it taught her resilience and the value of perseverance. In 1932, at the age of 16, Lyudmila married. It was a young marriage, and like many wartime unions, it was complicated. She gave birth to a son, but the marriage didn't last. The details of this period of her life remain somewhat private, but what's clear is that Lyudmila found herself as a young single mother, working in a factory and raising a child largely on her own. These challenges only seemed to strengthen her resolve. She continued shooting competitively, earning numerous awards and certifications. She also enrolled at Kyiv University, determined to get an education despite her circumstances. She chose to study history, fascinated by the great conflicts and leaders of the past. Little did she know that she would soon become a part of history herself. The late 1930s in the Soviet Union were tense times. Joseph Stalin's purges terrorized the nation, and the threat of war with Nazi Germany grew more real with each passing month. The Soviet government began preparing for the conflict many saw as inevitable, and this included training programs for civilians in military skills. Lyudmila joined a sniper training school while still at university. It was an extension of her shooting club activities, but more serious and militarized. The Soviet Union, learning from its experience in World War I, recognized the value of snipers in modern warfare. They were developing systematic training programs for sharpshooters, and Lyudmila was one of their star pupils. By 1941, Lyudmila was 24 years old. She was in her final year at Kyiv University, working toward her degree in history. She had a son to care for, work to do, and dreams for her future. She had become an expert marksman, but shooting had always been a hobby, a sport. She never imagined she would actually have to shoot at a human being. Then everything changed. The world at war, Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed across the Soviet border. Hitler's goal was to destroy the Soviet Union completely, to seize its vast resources, and to enslave or exterminate its people. The assault was devastating and swift. The news reached Kyiv quickly. For Lyudmila, as for millions of Soviets, the shock was profound. Despite the non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, despite all the diplomatic maneuvering, war had come. And it had come with unprecedented fury. The Soviet Union was caught unprepared. Stalin had ignored numerous warnings about the German buildup, convinced that Hitler wouldn't dare attack. The initial German assault destroyed much of the Soviet Air Force on the ground and captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, racing across Soviet territory at an alarming pace. In Kyiv, chaos reigned. The city would be in the direct path of the German advance. Soviet authorities began evacuating valuable resources and personnel eastward, but millions of civilians remained, unsure of what to do or where to go. The mood shifted from disbelief to fear to determination. This was the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets would call it, a fight for national survival. Lyudmila, like many Soviet citizens, felt an immediate urge to help defend her homeland. She had skills that could be valuable to the war effort. She was an expert marksman, trained as a sniper, physically fit and mentally tough. She made her decision quickly. She would join the Red Army. The rifle in her hands. Lyudmila went to the military recruitment office in Kyiv. It was crowded with people, mostly men, all trying to enlist. When Lyudmila's turn came, she stated her intention clearly. She wanted to join the Red Army as a sniper. The recruiting officers looked at her skeptically. A woman? In combat? As a sniper? Despite the Soviet Union's official position on gender equality, the reality was that very few women served in combat roles. The officers suggested she become a nurse instead. Lyudmila was furious. She had trained for years. She had her marksmanship certifications and records. She was probably a better shot than any of the men in that office. She refused to accept a nursing position. She wanted to fight. The argument might have continued, but Lyudmila had brought her shooting records with her. When she showed them her scores and certifications, the officers reconsidered. Here was someone with genuine, documented skill. In the desperate situation facing the Soviet Union, could they really afford to turn away a trained sniper just because she was a woman? After further evaluation and testing, Lyudmila was accepted into the Red Army with the rank of private. She was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division as a sniper. At 24 years old, with her son sent to live with relatives in the east for safety, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was going to war. Her first assignment was to defend Odessa, the major Soviet port city on the Black Sea. The Germans, advancing rapidly, were determined to capture this strategic location. The battle for Odessa would last 73 days, from August 5 to October 16, 1941, and it would be one of the most intense defensive battles of the early war. First blood. Lyudmila arrived at the Odessa front in August 1941. The reality of war immediately confronted her. This wasn't the controlled environment of a shooting range. This was chaos, explosions, gunfire, screaming, death. The city was under constant bombardment. The smell of smoke and cordite filled the air. Bodies lay in the streets. She was issued her rifle, a Mosin-Nagant 1891-30, the standard Soviet sniper rifle. It was a bolt-action rifle, reliable and accurate, equipped with a 4x PU scope. This weapon would become an extension of herself, a tool she would know more intimately than anything else in her life. But first, she had to take a human life. Lyudmila was positioned in the ruins of a building overlooking no man's land. German forces were advancing, trying to probe the Soviet defenses. Through her scope, she could see them moving, real men, not targets on a range. They had faces, uniforms, weapons. They were trying to kill her and her comrades. Her hands shook slightly as she aimed. This was different from anything she had experienced. On the range, you shot at paper targets. Here, she would be ending a human life. Could she do it? Should she do it? Then she remembered why she was here. These men were invaders. They had come to her country to kill her people, to enslave them, to destroy everything she loved. If she didn't stop them, they would kill her comrades, would advance further, would bring more death and destruction. She steadied her breathing. She aligned her shot. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she saw the German soldier fall. Her first kill. She had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Later, she would describe this moment simply, "He was an enemy soldier. I did what I had to do." But in that moment, she felt the weight of what she had done. She had taken a human life. She had become a killer. There was no time for reflection. More German soldiers were advancing. She chambered another round and found her next target. Squeeze. Fire. Another enemy down. Again and again she repeated the process. By the end of that first day, she had 2 confirmed kills. The criteria for a confirmed kill in the Soviet military was strict. Another soldier or officer had to witness the kill through binoculars or a scope. The target had to drop and not get up. These weren't estimates or guesses, these were verified deaths. It was a grim accounting, but in the terrible calculus of war, it was how snipers measured their effectiveness. The making of Lady Death. The siege of Odessa was brutal. The city was surrounded on 3 sides by enemy forces, German and Romanian troops, with only the sea at their back. The defenders were outnumbered and outgunned. German artillery pounded the city relentlessly. Air raids were constant. The Romanians, Germany's allies, attacked repeatedly, trying to break through the Soviet lines. In this crucible, Lyudmila honed her craft. Sniping is as much an art as a science, and she was mastering both aspects. She learned to read the battlefield, to find the perfect hiding spots, to remain absolutely still for hours. She learned to calculate for wind, distance, temperature, and even the rotation of the Earth at extreme ranges. She learned to slow her heartbeat and time her shots between heartbeats for maximum stability. But more than technique, she developed the psychological toughness required of a sniper. Sniping is a solitary profession. Unlike infantry who charge together or artillery crews who work as a team, snipers often work alone or with just one spotter. You wait, sometimes for hours or days, for the perfect shot. You watch your target through your scope, seeing them as individuals, lighting cigarettes, reading letters, laughing with comrades, and then you kill them. It requires a particular mindset, an ability to compartmentalize, to see the enemy not as fellow human beings but as targets, as threats that must be eliminated. Medical supplies were limited. Wounded soldiers often had to wait hours or days for treatment, and many died from wounds that might have been survivable under better conditions. Yet through it all, Lyudmila maintained her discipline and effectiveness. She cleaned her rifle meticulously, even when water was scarce. She kept her position organized and her equipment in order. She ate when she could, slept when possible, and when duty called, she was ready. Her gender, initially a source of skepticism among some of her male comrades, became irrelevant. She had proven herself in the most brutal testing ground imaginable. The men she fought alongside came to respect her not as a female soldier, but simply as a soldier, and an exceptionally good one at that. She formed close bonds with some of her fellow soldiers. In the shared misery and constant danger, friendships formed quickly and ran deep. Her comrades looked out for her, and she looked out for them. When a friend fell in combat, she mourned, but she also kept fighting. There would be time for grief later, if she survived. The wounds of war. In early June 1942, Lyudmila's war nearly came to an end. She was in her position, engaged in an extended firefight, when a German mortar shell exploded nearby. Shrapnel tore through her position, and she was hit. The wounds were serious, shrapnel injuries to her face and body. Blood poured from her wounds. She fell, unable to see clearly, her ears ringing from the explosion. For a moment, she thought this was the end. After all she had survived, after nearly 300 confirmed kills, after months in two of the war's most brutal sieges, a random mortar shell had found her. But her comrades rushed to her aid. They pulled her from her position under fire and carried her to the rear. Medical personnel worked frantically to stabilize her. The wounds to her face were particularly concerning. Would she lose her vision? For a sniper, blindness would be worse than death. She drifted in and out of consciousness, hearing the sounds of battle continuing around her. She was evacuated by ship from Sevastopol, joining the stream of wounded being taken to hospitals in the rear. The city's fall was imminent. Just weeks after she was evacuated, Sevastopol would finally fall to the Germans after its long, heroic defense. In the hospital, doctors worked to treat her wounds. Remarkably, her injuries, though serious, were not permanently debilitating. She would recover. Her face would bear scars, physical reminders of her service, but her vision was intact. She would be able to return to duty. But the Soviet command had other plans for her. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, with 309 confirmed kills, had become too valuable as a symbol to risk on the battlefield. She was one of the most effective snipers in the Red Army, possibly in the world. More importantly, at a time when the Soviet Union was suffering catastrophic losses and desperately needed good news, she was a propaganda gift. Her combat days were over, but her service to the Soviet Union was about to take a very different form. The propaganda war. From soldier to symbol. While Lyudmila recovered from her wounds, the war raged on. The Germans had captured Sevastopol and were driving deep into Soviet territory. The Battle of Stalingrad was beginning, a confrontation that would determine the fate of the entire war. The Soviet Union needed allies, needed support, needed anything that might turn the tide. One of the most important relationships was with the United States and Britain. The Soviets desperately needed American supplies: tanks, trucks, aircraft, food, weapons. The Lend-Lease program was providing these supplies, but there was debate in the West about whether to continue and expand support for the Soviet Union. Many Americans were skeptical about their communist allies. The Soviet government needed to humanize their struggle, to show Americans that ordinary Soviets were fighting for survival against Nazi aggression. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was perfect for this purpose. She was young, photogenic despite her scars, articulate, and had an incredible story. She was also a woman. A female sniper with over 300 kills was exotic and fascinating to Western audiences. The Soviet government decided to send her on a diplomatic tour of the United States and Britain. For Lyudmila, this was a strange turn of events. She was a soldier, a fighter. Now she was being asked to become a speaker, a representative, a symbol. It was not the role she would have chosen, but she understood its importance. If she could help secure more aid for the Soviet Union, if her story could save Soviet lives by bringing more supplies, then she would do it. In August 1942, Lyudmila traveled to the United States as part of a Soviet delegation. It was her first time outside the Soviet Union, her first time on an airplane, her first encounter with the Western world. The contrast with her recent experiences in the trenches of Sevastopol could not have been more stark. America meets Lady Death. Lyudmila's arrival in the United States created an immediate sensation. The American press was fascinated by her. Here was a young woman who had killed 309 enemy soldiers, more than most entire infantry companies. She wore her military uniform decorated with medals. She spoke frankly about the horrors of war and the necessity of defeating Nazism. But the American press didn't quite know how to handle her. Many journalists focused on superficial details: her appearance, her clothes, her marital status. One reporter asked if she wore makeup on the front lines. Another wanted to know if her uniform made her look fat. These questions enraged Lyudmila. At a press conference in Washington, D.C., she addressed these attitudes directly. She spoke of the patronizing coverage, saying, "I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist occupants by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" Her bluntness shocked some of her American hosts but won her admirers among those who appreciated her directness. She toured American cities, speaking at rallies and events. In Chicago, she addressed thousands of workers at international harvester plants. In Detroit, she spoke to automobile workers, thanking them for the trucks and tanks they were building that were going to the Soviet Union. Everywhere she went, she emphasized the same message: the Soviet people were fighting and dying to stop Nazi Germany, and they needed America's continued support. The tour was challenging for Lyudmila on a personal level. She was used to the straightforward world of combat, where things were clear: shoot the enemy, protect your comrades, survive. The world of diplomacy and public relations was more complicated. She had to be careful with her words, had to play a role, had to smile for cameras even when she was exhausted or frustrated. Unlikely friendships. One of the most remarkable aspects of Lyudmila's American tour was her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. The two women met in Washington and immediately formed a bond. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, one a Soviet sniper, the other an American aristocrat, they found common ground. Eleanor Roosevelt was impressed by Lyudmila's intelligence, courage, and dignity. She invited the Soviet sniper to stay at the White House as her personal guest, an unprecedented honor. For several days, Lyudmila lived in the White House, having long conversations with Mrs. Roosevelt about the war, about women's roles in society, about the future. The First Lady accompanied Lyudmila on some of her speaking tours. She introduced her to audiences, lending her considerable prestige to support Lyudmila's message. The two women would remain friends for years after the war, corresponding regularly and meeting when they could. Mrs. Roosevelt later wrote about Lyudmila in her newspaper column, My Day, praising the young Soviet woman's courage and dedication. She wrote about how Americans could learn from the Soviet example of women serving their country in all capacities, including combat. This friendship between the communist sniper and the American First Lady became a symbol of the wartime alliance between their nations. Lyudmila also met President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The president, while more reserved than his wife, was impressed by the young sniper. He understood her value as a symbol of Soviet-American cooperation and as evidence of the Soviet Union's total commitment to defeating Nazi Germany. He assured her that American support would continue. The British tour. After several months in the United States, Lyudmila traveled to Britain for a similar speaking tour. The British reception was somewhat different from the American one. Britain had been at war since 1939 and had experienced bombing, rationing, and years of hardship. The British public had a more visceral understanding of the war Lyudmila had been fighting. In London, she met with British officials and military leaders. She spoke at rallies and factories. She toured bomb damage in the city, seeing firsthand the destruction that German aircraft had inflicted on British civilians. The parallels to the destruction she had witnessed in Odessa and Sevastopol were clear. The British press, like their American counterparts, were fascinated by Lyudmila. But there seemed to be slightly more understanding of her as a soldier rather than just a curiosity. Britain had women serving in various military roles, though not in direct combat positions like Lyudmila. Still, The concept of women in uniform was less foreign. She was received by various British dignitaries and even met members of the royal family. She spoke at universities, sharing her experiences and urging continued support for the Soviet war effort. Throughout it all, she maintained her message. Nazi Germany was a threat to all civilization and had to be defeated through unified effort. The tour was exhausting. Lyudmila was still recovering from her wounds, both physical and psychological. She missed her son, whom she hadn't seen in over a year. She missed her comrades, still fighting and dying on the Eastern Front. But she understood that what she was doing was important, perhaps as important as her work as a sniper. Return to the Soviet Union. By late 1942, Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union. The war had turned in some ways. The German advance had been stopped at Stalingrad, and the first hints of what would become a Soviet counteroffensive were visible. But the conflict was far from over, and millions more would die before peace came. Lyudmila hoped to return to combat, but the Soviet command had other plans. She was too valuable as a symbol, too recognizable, and frankly, too effective a propaganda tool to risk. Instead, she was assigned to train other snipers. Her combat experience and proven techniques would be passed on to a new generation of Soviet marksmen. She also continued to serve in propaganda efforts. She made speeches to Soviet workers and soldiers. Her story was used in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films. She was living proof that the Soviet Union could produce heroes, that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary achievements when defending their homeland. But Lyudmila chafed at this role. She was a soldier, not a speaker. She wanted to be back on the front lines, rifle in hand, doing what she did best. However, orders were orders, and she had always been a disciplined soldier. If this was how she could best serve the Soviet Union, then this was what she would do. She also resumed her education, completing her degree in history at Kiev University. It was surreal to sit in classrooms studying ancient battles while the greatest war in history raged around her. But education had always been important to her, and she was determined to finish what she had started. The war's end and its aftermath. The war ground on for nearly 3 more years after Lyudmila's return from the West. The Soviets pushed the Germans back, liberating Soviet territory at enormous cost. The Battle of Kursk, the liberation of Ukraine, the push through Eastern Europe, millions died in these campaigns. Many of Lyudmila's comrades from Odessa and Sevastopol were among the casualties. When victory finally came in May 1945, the Soviet Union had paid an unimaginable price. 27 million Soviet citizens had died, soldiers and civilians. Entire cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced, orphaned, or widowed. The victory was real, but it was drenched in blood and tears. Lyudmila received numerous honors for her service. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. She received the Order of Lenin twice and numerous other medals and decorations. She had become one of the most decorated women in Soviet military history. But honors and medals couldn't erase what she had experienced. She had killed 309 enemy soldiers, 309 human beings. She had watched friends die. She had been wounded. She had seen horrors that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Like millions of other veterans, she carried invisible scars that no medal could heal. In the post-war years, Lyudmila continued her work with the Soviet military, helping to train new snipers and serving in various administrative capacities. She completed her education and eventually earned a master's degree in history. She became a historian and researcher, working on projects related to the war and Soviet military history. She also remained active in Veterans Affairs and Soviet-American friendship organizations. She never forgot her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, and the two women continued to correspond. When Mrs. Roosevelt visited the Soviet Union in 1957, she made a point of seeing Lyudmila. The two friends, now middle-aged, reminisced about their time together during the war years. Legacy and reflection.